The Democrats in D.C. have been and want to, at a much higher level, abolish our beautiful and successful suburbs by placing far-left Washington bureaucrats in charge of local zoning decisions. And what will be the end result is you will totally destroy the beautiful suburbs. Suburbia.
All right, folks, I'm glad you made it back. Our next guest says there's a concerted effort by those on the left to use the China virus crisis as a means to drive government-controlled housing into neighborhoods across this country, whether that means eliminating single-family zoning or using eviction moratoriums to create permanent refugee camps. It could be, well, coming to a neighborhood near you unless you take a stand. Robert Stilson is a research specialist at the Capitalist Research Center, and he joins us now to explain all this. Sir, welcome. Robert, you've written recently about these Housing Justice National Platform. What are the groups trying to accomplish, and how is the China virus helping them?
Yeah, so it's really just, it comes down to something called a homes guarantee. And so you have a set of activist groups and coalitions that have put out these platforms for a national homes guarantee. And what that amounts to is essentially a dramatic federal takeover of the housing sector in this country. So you would have increased private sector regulation on investors, developers, landlords, and at the same time, essentially a public option for housing. And so you drill down to the specifics of these platforms, and it's really just attempting to drive that in the United States. And they're using the coronavirus, the COVID-19, as a way to sort of take what has been the temporary, what most Americans view as temporary measures, eviction moratoriums, rent and mortgage deferments, things like utility shut-off moratoriums, and use that as say, no, these are not temporary measures. These are the beginnings of what we would like to see as a permanent new state of affairs in the housing sector of this country.
Got it. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, she wants to push something called Beyond Recovery, which is basically the elimination of rent, the elimination of mortgages. How's that going to work? I mean, how do you? Because there's somebody owes somebody who owes. It just goes down the line. Somebody owes somebody. How do you make a program like that work without fundamentally undermining your economy?
Yeah, I mean, somebody owes somebody owes somebody. It always stops with the taxpayer. And my understanding with Beyond Recovery, that's a project of one of these activist groups, and that's specifically to push that Mortgage Cancellation Act from Representative Omar. And the idea would be to just zero all that out on rent and mortgage, and then obviously the taxpayer would pick up the bill for what was owed. That's always what it comes down to, is the taxpayer is always going to be the one footing the bill. Right.
I mean, that basically it's bringing socialism to housing. So we all pay for all of our housing, except for hers, of course. Ilhan Omar, she gets to keep some money for herself, and she gets to, to have her mansion. And so does AOC, and so does Nancy Pelosi, and all those folks get to have their mansions, but we all have to bust our butts to support everything else. Yeah, I get it. What about the Fair Housing Restoration? This was an Obama brainchild, which basically said they were going to force high-income neighborhoods to take government-subsidized low-income housing. What is your take on this?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So that goes back all the way to the 1960s. The Fair Housing Act requires that localities affirmatively further fair housing, non-discrimination. So, obviously we don't want discrimination in any form in housing in this country. That rule, the Obama-era rule, affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, was an interpretation of that many saw as onerous on local governments, too much federal control, almost dictating how local communities could set themselves up, independent of any discriminatory intent or stuff that was unfair to prospective residents. And so what we've seen recently, just in the last few days, is a rollback of that rule that I think is trying to restore the balance between, on the one hand, saying, okay, well, we don't want, obviously we need to root out discrimination wherever we see it in housing, but at the same time, the federal government has no business, mandating 90, 92, or however many points of evaluation it was on local governments and grant recipients from HUD on local communities who so want to set themselves up the way that they want to.
Yeah, you know what? I think if If the government wants to do this, wants to mandate it, let's start with Obama first. Let's start with Nancy Pelosi first. Let's start with Alexandria. Well, she doesn't have. She has her apartment in Washington, D.C. But I'm saying let's start with socialist Democrats first. Let's go ahead and integrate their neighborhoods with federally subsidized housing and see how they like it. We'll do it with them first. Thank you, sir. Appreciate the time. Coming up, Democrats ignoring the violence in our cities, ignoring your pain. We'll discuss that with our political panel. Up next, Chris Salcedo Show here on Newsmax TV.